Well, thanks for coming. We appreciate you being here and talking with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you want to start off with your name, title, personal background?
Sure. So I'm a partner at Heritage Group on the investment team. I've been with Heritage for about 3 years, and prior to that, spent 15 years in New York. So started out in investment banking, and then the rest on the investing side, mainly growth equity and healthcare IT and healthcare services.
Mm-hmm. And tell me about Heritage Group. What do you guys do? What's your background?
Yeah, so we are a private equity fund based here in Nashville. Almost all of our investors are healthcare strategics. So we have 15 leading health systems. We have 9 insurers and others. And our model is really about deeply engaging with our investors and understanding what's strategically relevant to them. So where are these health systems and insurers spending their time and their capital over the next 1, 3, 5 years? That then informs where we look to invest across healthcare IT and healthcare services. Mm-hmm. And then we also work closely with portfolio companies to help them navigate our investor organization. So really trying to drive basically commercial growth.
Yeah. So you have a really good and broad knowledge of what the needs are in the industry widely.
Yeah, from the investor's lens, we do. And, one of the things we really like about our investor base is, like you said, it's a broad swath of different players within healthcare. You have both the provider ecosystem, you have the payer ecosystem, and so it is very broad in that regard.
Mm-hmm. And talk to me about your general portfolio. What type of companies do you invest in?
Yeah, so we invest pretty broadly across healthcare IT and healthcare services. I think within either of those groups, we're looking for companies that are really going to create, a great ROI for our investors. So they're either selling into provider systems, they're selling into payers. And across our portfolio, we have everything from, a number of investments within behavioral health, a number of investments in telehealth, which I know we'll talk about later, but really covering a pretty, wide swath of the healthcare ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. And I know you guys just closed a $300 million fund. What are you expecting to do with that?
Mm-hmm. So, our goal is to invest it in solution-oriented businesses. So companies that are increasing access to care, that are reducing cost of care, improving quality, really just trying to make an impact within healthcare and also deliver a really great return on investment for our investors.
Mm-hmm. And of course, like you said, we're here to talk about telehealth and how that has just changed so rapidly during the pandemic. What have you seen just generally about telehealth through as, this emergency period, 2020, people having to stay home and its utilization just skyrocketing? What have you seen?
Yeah, we've seen pretty much the same thing. So we were one of the first institutional investors in MD Live, which we sold to Cigna earlier this year. And kind of similar to what you saw at Teladoc and Amwell, where utilization rates were, just significantly increased. We saw the same thing at MD Live, just from a number of visits perspective. So a lot of that in urgent care, a lot in primary care too, right? You had folks really not wanting to go into a doctor's office, so you just therefore saw these virtual visits, significantly increase. And I think one of the challenges with that within the healthcare system is as these virtual visits increase, companies like MD Live and Teladoc and Amwell need to be able to recruit the physicians to actually complete those visits, right? So they're trying to quickly, staff up. And as a part of that, you need to pay physicians more to attract them to the platform. So I think across the industry, what you saw in 2020 was that impact of, very high revenue growth, but also a really steep increase in costs. And so you saw margins kind of decline in middle of 2020.
Mm-hmm. But of course, you guys sold MD Live earlier this year. You had it through this huge wave. That had to increase the value of the company. You sort of had a gold coin in your pocket.
Yeah, no, it was great from a timing perspective. And I do think that, the pandemic has really just shown a light on telehealth. I think consumers are more willing to use it. I think physicians are far more comfortable with it. And so I think to a large extent, it's something that's going to be, sustaining, past COVID.
Mm-hmm.
But we sold MD Live kind of during the pandemic when, all eyes were on telehealth. And so, it's obviously an attractive return to us as a fund.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think an interesting thing you said is that the margins are actually going down because they're having to recruit more physicians, more people to staff these sort of, telehealth solutions. And that's actually another place you guys are investing in with telehealth is trying to solve these physician store to shortages, specialist shortages. Tell me about those investments.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I think about telehealth right now. It's like there's a whole bucket of companies that are solving the problem around access to care. And those are companies like Teladoc and Amwell and MD Live. And then another, group of companies that are typically selling into hospital systems themselves as opposed to consumers. And they're solving that issue around staffing shortages. I mean, one of the number one or two kind of issues for our hospital system investors is that they just can't staff up to meet demand, and they're also seeing huge amount of turnover. In the nursing staff, for example, they're seeing first-year nurse graduates churning at about 25% a year. And one of our investors is up to like 35, almost 40% in terms of churn. So it's a huge issue. I think everyone's trying to find ways to solve it. And across our portfolio, we invested in a company called Avasure, which is in the telesitting space. And so they're kind of meeting that issue of, telesitting is essentially, 5% of the beds within a hospital require a nurse to actually physically sit there with the patient. So these are patients who have an extreme risk of falling, maybe they have suicide ideation and they really need that one-to-one, nurse ratio. And so if you can use a company like Avasure, which provides the technology and software to allow a hospital to centralize that nursing staff, you can then get to the point where one nurse can cover 5 beds. Mm-hmm. And so being able to move the needle like that for a hospital system right now, given the challenges that they're facing within these clinician shortages, is really, really impactful.
Mm-hmm. And tell me more about how telesitting works. So they're in there virtually, or they could be monitoring multiple patients at a time. Mm-hmm. But, it's not that in person, they can't intervene in any way. How does that work where they work with the in-person staff to maybe intervene if they need to?
Yeah, I mean, that's where you need a technology like Avasure, which is integrated into the other systems within the hospital. So they're able to kind of create that alerting system to the staff that's on the ground.
Mm-hmm. And what made that company attractive to buy into or invest in?
Yeah, so for us, it was the pain point that it's solving around the nursing shortage. And two, when you can move a ratio from 1-to-1, clinician to patient, to 5-to-1, that ROI to a hospital system is, very, very large. So they're essentially getting a 4 to 5 month payback. Mm-hmm. So for us, we're looking for companies that are going to be impactful to our investors. And, that's really what set Avasure apart to us, was the impact it could have on our systems and on their profitability and bottom line.
Yeah, because it not only, frees up in-person clinicians to attend to what they need to, but it saves the hospital that costly contract staffing money.
Exactly. Yeah. And it also allows nurses to do what they want to do. They're incredibly highly trained. They don't necessarily want to sit, for 24 hours and watch a patient sitting in a bed. So to be able to free up some nursing staff, to be able to, really work at the top of their license is also, a benefit to the hospital systems as well and to the nurses.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guys are investing in another company, Equum Medical?
Equum. Yeah, Equum Medical. So we're actually starting, it's a company that's based in New York, but we are opening up a Nashville presence. So the past few people that we've hired there are based here in Nashville, and we'll open up a small office, which we're all excited about. Yeah. But they're really touching on a similar pain point around shortages of clinicians. So they're a tele-ICU business. So essentially, solving for the issue around a lack of intensivists. And over time, they're also expanding into multi-specialties. Mm-hmm.
And you guys used them during the pandemic too. They opened up a service line and were incredibly useful. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so traditionally they work within the ICU. But during the pandemic, they also did a lot of work in the emergency department. So, being able to manage just an increase in patient flow and, obviously the shortage that we keep talking about. Mm-hmm. And, that had a huge impact for a number of their customers during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And what does that look like when you have it in the emergency department or the ICU? Like, I guess, what would a patient encounter? Yeah,
so the patient encounter, would be with the physician who is being brought in remotely, typically through, a video that's on a cart. Mm-hmm. But, I think the physicians at Equum, are just very highly trained and, really great bedside manner. And so I think from a patient experience, it's a very good experience, even though you're not kind of physically speaking to a physician in front of you.
Yeah. And I guess what I think is interesting is that it adds this like extra triage layer into these, they were emergency departments and ICUs were so congested during the pandemic that And there's always been this problem that people show up into the emergency department that don't necessarily need to be there. And it sort of adds that layer of, okay, well, we need to put you here, you're here, and it sort of optimizes the capacity issue that we faced.
Yeah. And, post-pandemic, a number of Equim's customers are expected to keep this service in place because they did see the benefit, during the pandemic. And another big piece of it is you have a number of patients that just because of the increase in volume, they've been discharged from the emergency department, but they haven't yet been admitted into the ICU. So they're kind of in this no man's land for a period of time. And that has a huge negative impact on mortality and quality. And so if you can have one of Equim Medical's physicians see that patient in the ED and provide care during that period of time where they're between the two departments, that's important too.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it fills the gap, but it's in a highly intensive area that I wonder if Equim or you guys have seen pushback for this acute care application.
We haven't. I would say that probably 5 years ago that would have been the case. I think hospital systems are more and more willing to have at least a portion of their ICU run remotely. It's worked. But I do think, 5 years ago, you would have seen more pushback than you see today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything is accelerated. It seems like a decade in this space.
Yeah.
But why are you bringing them to Nashville? Why are you opening an office here?
Yeah, mainly to be able to tap into the talent that we have here from a healthcare perspective within Nashville. There's great talent in New York as well, where they're based, but I think the quality of the healthcare talent and just kind of the deep roots within the industry are really unmatched in Nashville. And so the CEO management team and us at Heritage want to be able to access that talent for Equim.
Yeah, and I'm seeing telehealth be used everywhere. And I guess I'm even curious within the portfolio companies that you have that aren't necessarily focused on telehealth, do you see them implementing telehealth just to supplement their care models or, anything? Yeah,
we do. So during the pandemic, I know you had Spiro Health in to chat as a part of this series, and they're one of our portfolio companies, and they were able to stand up a telehealth offering very, very quickly during the pandemic, and it just was impressive, kind of the speed at which some of our portfolio companies have been able or were able, in the beginning of 2020 to do that. ShareCare would be another example in our portfolio, where they were able to stand up a service that enabled primary care physicians and other physicians to be able to start doing telehealth. So physicians who had never done it before were able to kind of get up and running within a matter of hours by working with ShareCare.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I guess moving on to broader market trends, I know you're in the investment space, and the distinction between telehealth investments in 2019 versus telehealth investments in 2020 and 2021, I imagine is pretty massive. Can you give me any insight into that?
Yeah, well, you're certainly seeing valuation increases, right? I think the way people thought about telehealth in 2019, there was still a lot of excitement around it, even pre-pandemic, but it's just that a light has been shown on telehealth, during the past year and a half, and that's had a huge impact on valuations. And, the other thing that we're seeing is, most kind of larger healthcare companies that haven't had a telehealth presence are just trying to buy something. So you see a lot of even relatively small transactions that have happened over the past 6 months where it's clear that they really just want to have a foothold within something in virtual care.
Yeah, so that's sort of interesting. It's like there's startups to, kind of institutions like you guys with MD Live. It's sort of interesting, the broad range of companies that are currently applying telehealth.
Yeah. I think one of the big areas within telehealth now is also behavioral health, right? Because that's another area that just has gotten a lot of attention during the pandemic. I think more and more people are comfortable seeking treatment and being honest and open about issues that they face, and so we see a lot of investment dollars being poured into the behavioral health side of telehealth as well.
Yeah. Are there any other sectors that stand out to you?
No, maybe virtual primary care, like some of the concierge models of being able to have a physician that you get to know over time, but being able to essentially, see them within 1 to 2 hours virtually is an area that's interesting. And those models are being sold through payers, through self-insured employers, just really trying to provide a better service, a better healthcare experience to a consumer or to an employee.
Mm-hmm. And what do you expect for, investing in telehealth in the future? Because it seems now like focusing on staffing shortages, that's like a real problem now, but will that be a problem in the future? Or do you see, telehealth being like a huge innovation space and where you can invest in that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we have spent a lot of time in telehealth, and MD Live, we made that investment in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think it's an area that we'll continue to spend time. We've made a number of investments, even in this most recent fund in telehealth with Abasher and with Equum. So I think it'll continue to be a focus for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And when you're looking at telehealth companies to invest in, what are some of the key traits that you look for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we look at the size of the market. So who are they selling into? What's the size of that market? We look at the kind of benefit that the end customer receives. So if that's the hospital system, what is the return to them? If they're going to make an investment in this subsector within telehealth, what is their return on that investment? And you want it to be significant. And I think the same is to be said on the consumer side. Like, what kind of benefit are they getting? And, that just kind of determines the strength of the business. We also look at utilization. So it's great to be able to offer telehealth, but, how many people are actually using it? What is your utilization rate? I think those are the main things. And just like any investment, it's also a lot about management team, the strength of the management team and their vision.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on and, sharing your wisdom. We really appreciate having you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.